Imagine this. You've just woken up 600 years ago. The sun is rising. The birds are chirping. Or maybe those aren't birds. Maybe it's a saber-toothed cat yawning in your direction. Breakfast options, berries that might kill you, or bugs that definitely will. And your neighbor? He's not arguing about property lines. He's literally trying to eat you. Welcome to the Stone Age. Tonight, we're drifting back into one of the darkest times in human prehistory. A world where death came early, often, and usually in ways that would make even horror movie directors say, that's a bit much. Now don't worry, I'll guide you through it slowly, gently, like a bedtime story your ancestors never got. We'll laugh a little, wince a little, and maybe feel grateful that our modern dangers are things like stepping on a Lego barefoot. So snuggle in, pull up your blanket fortress, and let's slip into a time when survival meant avoiding being squashed by falling rocks, frozen solid in an ice storm, or my personal favorite, accidentally inventing food poisoning before anyone knew what food poisoning was. This is the story of the most terrifying deaths in the Stone Age, 600 years ago. It's dark, it's weird, and yes, it's the perfect lullaby. You're lying back, eyelids heavy, and I'm going to glide you, slow and warm, into a world where the sky felt bigger because there were fewer roofs to interrupt it, where wind carried both the smell of rain and the gossip of predators, where mornings began not with a notification ding, but with the soft audit of survival. 600,000 years ago isn't a single postcard, so much as a long, flickering film reel of seasons and migrations. Ice grew like slow thunder in the far latitudes, then relaxed. Grasslands rolled out like green carpets, and then browned into tough wicker. Forests breathed and retreated. Rivers rerouted the way a drowsy mind changes dreams. Imagine a mosaic of habitats, stitched together savannas, studded with acacia silhouettes, scrubby hills, riverine corridors, open woodland with pockets of shade like spilled ink, and, farther north and south, the shoulders of expanding glaciers, bright and sharp as teeth. The people walking there were not yet us, at least not in the passport photo sense. Call them ancestors, big-brained, heavy-browed, beautifully pragmatic. They carried the Acheulean multi-tool, a hand axe shaped like a teardrop and confidence, the kind of rock you could butcher with, dig with, or hold because it felt right in the palm. Fire was a rumor you could sometimes rely on and sometimes couldn't. On good days, it was borrowed lightning, tamed in a ring of stones, coaxed with dry grass and patience. On bad days, it was an uncooperative celebrity, refusing to appear. The night without it was not pitch black. It was velvet stitched with stars, so bright that even silence threw shadows. There were neighbors. Some had names in our later textbooks: saber-toothed cats, stretching like living scythes, giant hyenas with jaws like nutcrackers, lions big enough to make a camp think devout thoughts. There were elephants and straight-tusked cousins, hippos in the green-brown water who wore the expression of bouncers, and herds whose hooves braided paths into the soil. Birds with clever eyes watched, then told no one. Insects narrated the understory. The climate was moody, yes, but not malicious. It simply had agendas larger than any single life. The air on a dry season morning could be as crisp as the snap of a twig, and a midday sun could iron out the wrinkles in a horizon, turning heat shimmer into a mirage of water you had to actively disbelieve. People travelled in bands, not too large to outrun, and not too small to be outnumbered by a determined leopard. There were old ones with maps in their heads, small ones with questions in theirs, and in between, the reliable wedge of Edo maturity who did the heavy hauling of days. Language, perhaps not yet operatic, but the body knows how to talk. Hands sketching in air, eyes tilting toward rustled grass, a soft click to say, wait, and a low hum to say, stay. A laugh that allowed tension to loosen its bootlaces. Laughter mattered. You could not eat it, but you could digest a day better with it. Shelter was opportunistic caves when the caves would have you. Overhangs, thorny palisades on open ground, sleeping circles that made the body's heat a gently shared economy. Bedding was grasses and skins, and the pillow was often an arm. The soundtrack? A coyote chorus if you were out west eons later. Here, a different arrangement. Hyenas chuckling like it was their club. Owls who did not care for your opinions. The occasional hippo arguing with itself. Frogs holding the low notes. Crickets lifting the high. Water decided where you could be. Rivers were highways and boundaries, dining rooms and hazard zones. Most disagreements between humans and the world began when someone misread a river's resume. Food was a menu of contingencies. You might garden the day by nudging tubers from their hiding or plucking figs, while bees made side-eye. You might find a carcass before someone with better teeth did. You might trade risk for protein and step into the grand, foolish ballet of hunting, which is really negotiation with physics and fate. Tools were not just rocks, but ideas in mineral edges that carried decisions. And time moved not in calendars, but in counts. How many rains since the tall tree fell? How many dry seasons since the old woman's laugh? How many months since the boy stopped limping? Death visited often, and without RSVP, but it was not the only thing happening. There were also hands smoothing hair, stories in the amber of twilight, the sweetness of a rare wind that smelled like distant rain and nearer safety, a baby's soft foot kicking against a mother's ribs, the collective sigh of a band when the fire finally took and the day could be folded neatly. This world was dangerous, yes, but it was also astonishingly, relentlessly alive. The grass kept trying. The river kept writing. People kept making the next right move, then the next. When the cold leaned in from the horizon, they learned to tuck themselves tighter. When heat pressed its palm to their backs, they moved like shade itself had wheels. To live here was to be a student of edges, the edge where light becomes dark, where dry becomes wet, where sound becomes signal. You were small, but not powerless. You were fragile, but not helpless. And just as your breath now finds an easy rhythm, theirs did too. In, because here we are. Out, because we made it through today. If you listen close, you can hear the note that hums under everything. Continuity. It says, we have been in difficult rooms before. It says, love is a hand on your shoulder and a lookout's finger pointing quietly toward a path. It says, the sky is older than your worry, and we are, somehow, its children. The ground was honest. It would tell your feet exactly what you were stepping into. The horizon was undefeated. It always arrived, and people always walked toward it anyway. So when we speak, in a little while, about the ways things ended, understand that endings were stitched to beginnings, like two sides of the same cloak. The cloak kept being mended, passed along, tried on again. You are under that same cloak now, listening, breathing, letting the day loosen its grip, and the wind that lifts its hem is the same curious wind that once carried ash and laughter down a long, river-lit valley. Every day, back then, was an obstacle course designed by a mischievous universe, with no waiver forms. Not the flashy kind, with foam pits and theme music, but the subtle kind, where daily errands were tiny heroes' journeys. Waking up wasn't guaranteed. It was an achievement badge. If you had a headache, it was not because you'd scrolled too long. It might be dehydration, or a tooth putting in its 2 cents. Hydration was a relationship you maintained personally, no app reminders. Only the dry truth of your mouth, and the memory of a spring 2 hills over. You learned to drink when you could, and carry in your body what you couldn't carry in your hands. Imagine beginning a morning with a quiet inventory. Ankles, Obedient? Yes. Knee that argued yesterday. Still a debater. A nick on the thumb from yesterday's flint. Keep it clean. Keep it covered with whatever plant says. I'm good at this. Breakfast was not what sounds good. It was what is both present and not secretly plotting my demise. Berries advertised themselves rudely, all colour and confidence. Some would love you. Some would end you. And the trick was ancestral gossip. Taste, a speck. Wait. Watch your tongue, report back. Roots had the patience of saints and the bitterness of old grudges. With fire and leaching, they became dependable calories. Insects were the original protein bars, especially if you preferred your snacks with legs and lessons about humility. And every mouthful was a classroom. Today's stomach made a note for tomorrow's foraging list. That plant is fine in small quantities. Those leaves are selfish with their toxins. That fish in that pool, at that hour, is basically a polite invitation. Movement was your employer and your union. A camp might last a night or a season. You learned to read the contracts written in tracks, where the herds had come from, where they chose to forget you existed, where a cat had reconsidered its route. The ground was a memoir under revision. To walk was to think with your hips. Slopes negotiated with your calves. Streams negotiated with your judgment. Do you cross here, where the stones are slick as new ideas, or upriver, where the water is deeper but honest about it? Even rest had tactics. Sit with your spine against a trunk that can alert you to anything sharing your shade. Nap only when someone's eyes are on you and the fire is feeling loyal. We tell ourselves now that multitasking is modern, but imagine scanning for snakes, tracking a friend's voice, scanning the horizon for dust raised by hooves, and simultaneously remembering that your cousin once ate those mushrooms and immediately invented interpretive dance. Humor, I should say, was not ornamental. It kept the group from overheating emotionally. A good joke could unwind a tight silence and remind everyone that they belonged to one another. It also helped the day go down easier, like a spoonful of honey stolen from a hive when the bees were out gossiping. Injuries were both common and consequential. A twisted ankle was not just inconvenient, it was a family project. The group slowed. Shoulders took turns, carrying weight. The injured learned humility, and also the medicinal talents of plants, with names we can't easily translate. But that tasted like determination. Infection lurked at the rim of every cut, and infections did not negotiate. Dirt was both friend and frenemy, rich with information. Poor at hospitality when invited into wounds. The earliest healthcare plan involved boiling, smoking, washing in running water, and the quiet miracle of bodies that, given the chance, choose to forgive us. Predators put the edge in the day. Cats loved tall grass, the way secrets love corners. Hyenas were laughter with muscles. Crocodiles were patience, dressed as furniture. You learned choreographies. The way to stand to seem larger. The way to cluster so the young were in the warm middle. The way to back away without peeling your prayer off the moment. We think of courage as loud, but back then it was often silent and slow, walking your fear at arm's length to the stream and back. Heat was a blunt instrument, and cold was a thief with soft shoes. There were days when the sky pressed its face close enough to feel its breath, and you learned to make friends with shade. By manufacturing it, skins stretched into reluctant tents, smoke encouraging insects to find new careers. There were nights when the temperature stepped off a cliff, and you kept the fire fed the way you'd feed a hungry uncle, frequently, with respect, and while telling it stories about all the wood it will become. Speaking of stories, knowledge was the original inheritance. A child learned the shape of a safe riverbank by tracing it with toes, learned which cloud means thirst and which means gracious delay. Learned that if the birds go silent all at once, your legs should ask fewer questions and make more haste. The curriculum had no exams, only consequences, and yet there was sweetness that made risk worth the trouble. The taste of fat after a lean stretch is a kind of music. The coolness under flat stones at noon was an air-conditioned sigh. A hand axe shaped just right sings in the hand like a well-tuned instrument, and the first spark coaxed from stubborn tinder is nothing less than a love poem to persistence. Competition existed, but so did choreography with other bands. Sometimes paths crossed and voices stayed low and friendly. Sometimes someone decided a patch of figs belonged exclusively to their biography, and you had to demonstrate the art of de-escalation with open palms and long memories. Violence, when it came, was expensive. Everyone knew the price. And so, everyone bargained hard to avoid paying it. Daily life, then, was not a drumroll of disaster, but a suite of small negotiations, with hunger, with heat, with distance, with the social weather of people you couldn't afford to lose. If you think of it like an extreme sport, imagine rules written by ecology and referees that were impartial. Physics, biology, time, no sponsorships, no instant replays. Only the long, beautiful practice of trying again tomorrow. Still, the ledger of risks included strange, slapstick mishaps that would read as comedy if the stakes weren't so high. Someone would step into a burrow mid-sprint and invent the pratfall. Someone would underestimate the enthusiasm of bees and sprint heroically into a shrub that did not consent to be sprinted into. Someone would attempt to carry too many things and learn that gravity is persuasive. Laughter came first, always, then care. Then retelling around a fire until the sting dimmed and the lesson brightened. What kept people intact was the net that caught them when they fell. A circle of faces familiar enough to lend you their stamina, their water, their margin for error. You could not lone wolf a lifetime. The day ended, as days still do, with the recalibration of light into dark and the sound of bodies finding their favorite sleeping positions. The danger did not clock out, but it took a dinner break. Fire breathed and exhaled. Someone kept watch with the concentration of a night librarian. Someone dreamed of rivers that ran in both directions and of grass that parted for them like they were a rumor the world wanted to believe. And without fanfare, the truth that knits us to them arrives. The thin line between peril and peace is often a few good decisions, shared well. Tomorrow, we'll move closer to the cold's long fingers and how a body can become a winter story without intending to. For now, the ground is warm, the stars are on their best behavior, and your pulse has remembered the lullaby it learned before language. The cold has a way of sneaking up on you, not with drama, not with lightning or roars, but with that sly, creeping insistence, the way a draft under the door makes you shuffle in your blanket. 600,000 years ago, the draft wasn't under the door. It was the entire outdoors. Imagine walking out into the pre-dawn air on a winter morning, without Gore-Tex, without wool socks, without even the dignity of a coffee waiting. The cold pressed its whole hand on you at once, fingers wrapping around ears, toes, nose, the tender edges of you. And here's the trick. Your body, noble as it is, doesn't argue for very long. At first it shivers valiantly, trying to generate heat by rattling your bones together, like a percussion section. But soon it slows, as if saying, "All right, boss, if this is the plan, we'll save energy by becoming an icicle." Hypothermia was the uninvited guest at every Stone Age camp, and it was a better hunter than any saber-toothed cat. Frostbite was the cold's personal autograph. It went after extremities first, the toes poking out of animal hide shoes that were more hope than insulation, the fingers that dared to linger too long on cold stone tools, the noses that sniffed too curiously into icy winds. Blood flow retreated from these edges, the way a child retreats from chores. The result was numbness that could feel almost pleasant, until the damage revealed itself in skin, turning pale, waxy, even black. No heating pads, no hand warmers, no quick run into the house for a cup of tea. Just pain, the smell of smoke if you were lucky enough to have a fire, and the eternal question of whether you'd keep all 10 toes. Clothing was the Stone Age equivalent of layering up, except without the catalogues. Animal skins were scraped, dried, and tied together, sometimes lined with grasses, sometimes just draped and prayed over. Fur was gold, but fur also shed, and fur was warm only until it got wet. Once soaked, it became the prehistoric version of carrying around a soggy couch cushion. Keeping dry was as important as keeping warm, but storms, melting snow, and slips into streams made that a near impossible ambition. Early humans learned quickly that a wet hide was worse than no hide at all. Cotton kills, we say now. But 600,000 years ago, it was anything wet kills. So please stop falling into rivers. Fire helped. But fire was fickle. We'll get to its betrayals in a moment. For now, think about what it meant to face nightfall. The sun vanished early in winter, and the dark arrived not politely but in a rush, dragging with it temperatures that bit harder every hour. Hypothermia was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a person slipping into sluggishness, confusion, mumbling nonsense to their companions, and then, heartbreakingly, feeling warm again at the very end. The paradoxical undressing that often accompanies severe hypothermia, where a freezing person begins removing clothes, might have happened then, too. Imagine the confusion of seeing someone take off their precious fur, wrap in the middle of a storm, smiling dreamily as if they'd discovered a secret beach. Cold-shaped migration, too. It told bands where they could not go, which valleys were death traps in winter, which ridges offered no shelter from winds that knifed sideways. It made caves valuable real estate, though caves also had their own hazards, like bears, who considered them pre-leased, and it forced cooperation. You could not warm yourself entirely by willpower. You needed the fire. You needed others pressed close, body heat pooled together, the group as radiator. Without that, the cold erased individuals one by one, quietly, efficiently, the way frost erases footprints by morning. And yet, against this, humor persisted. Perhaps someone complained about toes being optional equipment. Maybe someone compared their nose to a berry left too long in the snow. Laughter helped circulation, if only by making chests bounce. It certainly helped morale, which in a long night could be as vital as kindling. Cold was cruel, yes, but cold was also a teacher, and the lesson was blunt. Prepare, share, and never underestimate a breeze that sounds harmless. Even now, in our insulated homes, that lesson lingers, tucked under the quilts with us. Fire, on the other hand, was the opposite personality. Where cold killed by subtraction, fire killed by enthusiasm. It was new, it was dazzling, and it was about as trustworthy as a toddler with a chainsaw. Early humans probably first met fire, not as a friend, but as a disaster, a wildfire sparked by lightning, racing through dry grass, a tree struck and hollowed into a torch by chance. The first instinct was to run. The second, braver instinct was to stay close enough to feel its warmth and imagine possibilities. Warmth was seductive. Cooked food was revolutionary. Fire extended daylight, made predators hesitate, and gave humans something dramatic to sit around while telling each other half-true stories. But taming it was a comedy of errors with a body count. Picture the scene. A small band manages to carry embers from a struck tree, keeping them alive in a bundle of smouldering material. They feed it carefully, blow gently, and suddenly it roars higher than intended, setting an entire hut of dry grass ablaze. The fire is now less pet and more arsonist. Early camps learned quickly that distance was love. Fire needed to be near enough to help, far enough not to consume. But without metal pits or fireproof hearths, accidents were inevitable. Embers leapt like drunken dancers, landing on furs, on hair, on carefully collected stores of dried meat. A small slip could turn dinner into disaster. Burns were common. Imagine bare hands experimenting with sticks poked into flames, curious children treating it like a toy, adults misjudging how long a branch could smolder before exploding into sparks. A burn in a world without ointments or antibiotics was not just painful, it was potentially fatal. Infections slid into damaged skin, the way wind slides into cracks. Someone who stumbled into the fire after a feint or a fight might be scarred for life or simply not survive. The hot killer was merciless, and it worked quickly. Then there was smoke. Picture a cave filled with eager firelight, everyone pleased with their achievement, only to realize the smoke is collecting in the ceiling and descending like an invisible predator. Eyes sting, lungs protest, and people stumble out coughing, dragging half-burnt logs. The lesson about ventilation had to be learned repeatedly, sometimes fatally. Fire could suffocate as easily as it could warm, yet they kept trying. Because once you've had roasted marrow bones, you don't want to go back to chewing raw sinew. Once you've felt the night air held at bay by a friendly blaze, you don't want to surrender again to cold's quiet cruelty. Fire was risk, but fire was promise. It became the center of ritual, of community, of innovation. People learned to stack stones, to cradle it, to choose fuel carefully, to respect its moods. They learned that green wood sulks, dry wood sings, and pine needles are treacherously eager. They learned that fire likes to eat constantly and can never be trusted alone. And somewhere, in the long experimentation, laughter must have bubbled up. Someone singed their eyebrows leaning too close. Someone tripped over the woodpile and invented the slapstick fall. Someone tried to wave smoke away and ended up looking like they were dancing badly. Humor, again, was survival. It softened the sting of burns and the smell of hair gone in a flash. It reminded everyone that even disasters could be stories by tomorrow. But the serious truth was that fire took lives as often as it saved them in those early centuries of practice. Entire shelters were lost, supplies reduced to ash, children burned in the blink of an eye. It was both guardian and executioner, and its double face shaped our caution even today. We build fences around campfires, install alarms in our houses, and treat flame with both reverence and fear because our ancestors learned, painfully, that fire has no loyalty. It gives, and it takes, and it always demands respect. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine that flicker on the wall of a cave, shadows swaying like dancers, the air warm and dry, the smell of roasted roots promising a meal. Imagine also the quiet worry in every mind. Keep watch, feed it carefully, don't turn your back. Fire was love and terror, a bright guardian with sharp teeth. And in its glow, humanity grew, singed, laughed, and carried on. Imagine stepping out of the cave at dawn, stretching, rubbing your eyes, maybe yawning a little too loudly, and realizing that somewhere out there, in the tall grass, something with fangs the size of steak knives is also stretching, yawning, and considering you as the day's breakfast option. Life, 600,000 years ago, was a never-ending episode of Who Wants to Eat Me? The contestants were varied and enthusiastic. Some prowled on four legs, some waited with patience, and all of them looked at humans, not as future builders of civilization, but as particularly slow, crunchy snacks. The saber-toothed cats, for example, were the celebrities of fear. They didn't just hunt, they made an entrance. Canine teeth longer than your hand, a face designed by an artist obsessed with intimidation, and a hunting strategy that relied on ambush. You didn't see them until you were already starring in their lunch plans. Picture trying to forage for berries while keeping one eye on the bush and the other on the suspicious silence of grass. That silence wasn't peace. It was probably whiskers, and then there were the hyenas. Except these weren't the kind we picture cackling at cartoons. Giant hyenas, big as lions, with jaws that could crunch through bone like breadsticks. They were the cleanup crew of the prehistoric savannah, except they weren't waiting for you to finish dinner. They were willing to skip ahead and make you the dinner. A group of them could surround a small band of humans, laughing that uncanny, echoing laugh that must have sounded like a haunting chorus in the night. Imagine trying to sleep while that sound rolled over the plains. It was a lullaby that said, "See you soon, see you soon." Lions existed too, though they were larger than the modern ones, more heavily muscled, with attitudes to match. Crocodiles lurked in rivers. Hippos weren't shy about asserting themselves, and wolves in their early, oversized forms roamed in packs that didn't exactly respect your personal space. You couldn't walk anywhere without being somebody's potential calorie source. Humans back then were not apex predators. They were, at best, cautiously tolerated scavengers. If you stumbled upon a carcass, you had to eat quickly, nervously, like someone snacking on cake at work before their coworker asked for a slice. Predators didn't care that you were inventing culture and tool use. They cared that you had meat on your bones and probably weren't fast enough to escape. The truth is, our ancestors survived not by being stronger or scarier, but by being clever and communal. You slept close, you kept watch, and you learned to read the language of alarm calls from birds and the sudden hush of monkeys. Even silence became a form of shouting. It meant something with teeth was passing through. Humor might have been the only defense, besides running. Maybe someone whispered, "If I get eaten first, tell my story better than I lived it." And the others laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because laughter made the hair on your neck lie back down. The predators were everywhere, yes, but so was the will to keep going. And when you woke in the morning and realized you hadn't been taken in the night, that was victory, the kind you didn't brag about, but carried quietly in your chest. Now, if the big predators were the obvious nightmare fuel, the small ones were the pranksters with a cruel streak. Insects and parasites made sure that no human ever truly relaxed, even in places that looked peaceful. The buzzing began as soon as the air warmed. Mosquitoes, the eternal villains of summer evenings, were there in prehistoric form, their wings whining in the ear like tiny dentists. Their bite wasn't just an itch, it was a delivery system for fevers, parasites, and diseases that could drag a strong body down in days. Imagine lying in the dark of a cave, scratching at a welt, and realizing the buzzing hadn't gone away, it had just multiplied. Your blood was currency, and the insects ran the market. Ticks hid in tall grasses, waiting with patience that would shame saints. Lice turned every scalp into an amusement park. Fleas lived in bedding, jumping like deranged acrobats, biting ankles, and making sure that sleep was never uninterrupted. Every part of the body was a potential venue for discomfort. Ears could host mites, bellies could churn with worms, skin could erupt in rashes from stings. There was no bug spray, no ointment, no netting, only scratching, suffering, and the occasional herbal experiment. Some plants soothed, others didn't. And trial and error meant your cousin probably ended up rubbing poison ivy on himself once and becoming a cautionary tale. The insects weren't just irritants, they were storytellers of their own. A cloud of flies meant something had died nearby, a signal both useful and unsettling. The absence of buzzing in certain seasons meant drought was brewing. Even their chaos contained lessons, though those lessons usually came with swollen ankles and feverish nights. Humor found its way into this battlefield too. Maybe someone swatted at their own back, thinking it was a fly, only to realize it was their shadow. Maybe someone scratched so furiously They looked like they were auditioning for a new dance. The laughter helped, but it didn't stop the bites. The irony of the insect world was that these creatures, smaller than a thumbnail, were often deadlier than the cats and hyenas. Predators might take one person, one night, but mosquitoes and parasites could weaken whole groups, draining energy, carrying sickness, turning every step into exhaustion. They were invisible hunters, sneaky in their persistence. You could guard a cave entrance with spears, but you couldn't guard your bloodstream from a mosquito's needle. You could scare off a hyena with fire, but no flame kept lice from setting up a new colony in your hair. Still, life went on. People itched, they groaned, they scratched each other's backs, and they carried forward. They learned to wash wounds in streams, to smear mud as a cooling balm, to pick at parasites with patient fingers. They learned that surviving wasn't about defeating the bugs, but enduring them. And perhaps in the middle of a long, itchy night, someone whispered, "If the mosquitoes don't kill me, the scratching will." The others laughed softly, and the buzzing kept on. But the night passed, and in the morning, the sun rose, as it always did, lighting a world where the biggest threats sometimes had the smallest wings. Hunger in the Stone Age was not a mild inconvenience, not the kind of thing where you wandered to the fridge, sighed at leftovers, and then ordered takeout. Hunger was an uninvited roommate that moved in quickly, took over your body, and then whispered relentlessly in your ear. 600,000 years ago, food was not guaranteed. You could have a week where roots were plentiful, where berries hung ripe, where a scavenged carcass offered precious fat and protein, and then suddenly, nothing. The tubers shriveled, the animals shifted their migrations, the berries dried up, and the hunters came back with nothing but stories of missed throws and tracks that ended at cliffs. When food ran out, it wasn't a single stomach growling. It was an entire band growing quieter, weaker, their movements slower, conversations less frequent, laughter replaced with the dull rhythm of survival. The body itself tried to cope. At first, hunger made you sharp, edgy, alert. The smell of roasted meat, if anyone nearby was lucky, could practically drag you by the nose. Every sound seemed like a possible clue to food. But as days passed, muscles began to cannibalize themselves. Fat reserves melted away, and faces grew hollow. Skin stretched tight over bone, and eyes looked larger. Not from wonder, but from want. The youngest and the oldest suffered first, and those in between carried the guilt of being too weak to help them, but too stubborn to give in. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical one. Starvation made tempers short and patience shorter. Small disagreements over scraps became heated, though rarely violent, because violence required energy no one had. People turned to desperate measures. Leather straps might be boiled in water until they softened into chewable strips. Bark might be gnawed for whatever hint of sustenance it could offer. Insects, once an optional snack, became a banquet. And sometimes, when starvation pressed hardest, people turned to carrion so old it made the air sour, the kind of meat that invited sickness, but also offered calories too precious to refuse. Humor, against all odds, clung to them, even in famine. Someone might joke weakly that their ribs made excellent xylophones now, or that they were becoming lighter and therefore faster, an evolutionary upgrade courtesy of starvation. Laughter came thin, but it came, and in that laughter was the reminder that even hunger could not silence every part of the human spirit. It was this strange balance, desperation, and resilience that allowed small groups to outlast long, hungry seasons. Not everyone survived, but someone always did, and that was enough to carry the species forward. Starvation was not just about empty bellies. It shaped human culture, memory, and planning. It taught the value of storing food, of preserving, of sharing, and of remembering which places betrayed you last year. It taught that the line between survival and collapse could be as thin as a handful of dried berries hidden in a pouch. And as you drift tonight toward your own sleep, safe and full, you might consider how remarkable it is that your ancestors endured those endless nights of hunger so that you could sigh at leftovers and still live to tell the story. Water should have been a gift. Sparkling streams cutting through valleys, lakes reflecting skies, rivers offering coolness after heat. But in the Stone Age, water was both salvation and betrayal, a shimmering promise that sometimes kept and sometimes killed. Drowning was as real a risk as any predator. Humans were not born swimmers, and most rivers 600,000 years ago weren't calm trickles. They were powerful, unpredictable, swollen with seasonal rains. Crossing them wasn't about splashing playfully, it was about gambling with currents that could sweep even the strongest adult downstream like a twig. Children, pulled into the water by curiosity or accident, often never resurfaced. Adults, trying to carry firewood or carcasses, sometimes vanished too, their belongings found later, tangled against rocks. A slip of the foot could mean an entire family's future washed away. Even when the water didn't drown you, it might poison you. Streams that seemed clear could carry invisible killers. Parasites, bacteria, and stagnant pools offered fevers, diarrhea, and wasting illnesses that drained strength faster than hunger. Without microscopes, without understanding, early humans only had patterns to rely on, that certain pools always made people sick, that moving water was usually safer, that boiling, when you had the luxury of fire, could sometimes turn danger into safety. Trial and error was brutal. Whole families might fall ill before the lesson took root. And then, of course, water hid predators of its own. Crocodiles lay like logs until logs suddenly had teeth. One quiet sip could become the last sound you ever made. Hippos, seemingly comical with their round bellies, could erupt into violence faster than you could blink, turning rivers red. Even fish posed hazards when sharp bones caught in throats. Water, the thing you couldn't live without, was the same thing that could end you at any moment. Humor, again, became a life preserver. Maybe someone joked that the crocodiles were the original landlords charging rent for every drink, or that a hippo was just a boulder with bad manners. These jokes didn't reduce the danger, but they made fear bearable, gave it shape, gave it something that could be laughed at instead of only dreaded. Still, respect for water grew deep in human culture. It was never taken lightly, never approached without thought. The drowned were remembered, the sick were mourned, and the survivors carried forward hard-won lessons. Drink moving water, watch the banks, never turn your back on a quiet pool. Water gave life, but it also demanded humility, and in that humility, people found survival. So tonight, as you sip your glass of water by your bed, clean and safe, think of the endless generations who bent to rivers in fear and reverence. Their caution became your inheritance. Their losses became your wisdom, and their persistence ensured that you, unlike them, can drink without checking first for teeth. There's something deeply comforting about the idea of a cave, a roof without rent, a wall without labor, shade in summer, warmth in winter, and a sense of safety when the wind is howling through the trees outside. Our ancestors, 600,000 years ago, certainly thought so too. Caves were magnets for survival. They offered shelter from predators, storage for food, a natural stage for firelight storytelling, and protection from rain. But caves had one design flaw. They were made of rock, and rock doesn't always feel like staying put. Imagine settling into the perfect corner, the fire crackling, bellies full from a rare successful hunt, and then crack. A sound sharper than thunder, heavier than any heartbeat. A stone shifts above you, dust drifts down, and suddenly your safe haven reveals its darker side. Rockfall roulette was a game no one wanted to play, but everyone had to. Caves were not engineered. They were accidents of geology, and geology is patient but not always reliable. Rainwater seeped into cracks, freezing and thawing with the seasons, widening fractures until slabs of stone were poised like guillotines. Earthquakes, small ones, the kind you might not even notice, could shuffle boulders into precarious positions. A fire's heat might weaken stone, or roots worming their way down could pry a roof apart, grain by grain. All it took was the wrong vibration, a shift in weight, and gravity's eternal patience turned into sudden violence. For early humans, this meant shelter was both a blessing and a gamble. There were probably warning signs, faint cracks, odd echoes, the way dust occasionally trickled for no reason. But in a world where everything was trying to kill you, one more potential hazard was just another voice in the choir. Maybe the group decided to risk it anyway, because rain was pouring down outside, or because predators were prowling, their eyes shining in the firelight. Safety was relative, and sometimes you chose to sleep beneath a ceiling you didn't entirely trust, rather than under an open sky that felt like an invitation to every fang and claw. When caves collapsed, the consequences were immediate and brutal. A falling boulder didn't just bruise, it crushed. Limbs snapped, skulls caved, lives ended in seconds. Survivors emerged coughing and bleeding, dragging each other out from rubble, staring at what had been their refuge with a mix of grief and betrayal. And yet, after mourning and regrouping, many would return to caves again. Because where else could you go? The open plains offered exposure to cold and predators, the forests hid lurking dangers, and caves, despite their temperamental nature, were still the best compromise. There's a grim kind of humor in imagining ancient conversations about this. Someone might have joked, "If the roof falls on me, at least I'll finally be part of the foundation." Another might have pointed out that at least when a cave collapsed, it was quick, unlike starvation or infection, which dragged on mercilessly. Morbid humor became a shield, a way to turn terror into something the group could laugh at by firelight, even if only half-heartedly. Cave collapses, shaped human caution. Over generations, groups learned to favor certain shelters, ones with thick roofs, with walls that didn't groan when you leaned against them, with floors free from suspicious piles of old rubble. They became amateur geologists out of necessity, reading the language of stone without textbooks. And in that careful watching, humans began their long habit of modifying the environment, propping rocks, arranging barriers, shaping nature to suit themselves, rather than just accepting the gamble. Rockfall roulette was never eliminated, but over time, it became less of a reckless spin and more of a carefully weighted bet. When you lie in your bed now, with drywall and beams holding steady above you, it's worth remembering that safety has always been relative. Your roof doesn't creak with the shifting of glaciers, and your ceiling won't crumble from the heat of a nearby fire. Our ancestors didn't have that certainty, but they carried on anyway, finding rest in places that might betray them, because rest was as essential as food. And perhaps, in the silence before sleep, you can hear that old whisper of dust falling, a reminder that security has always been fragile, and that the courage to close your eyes anyway is one of humanity's oldest talents. Injury, unlike predators or storms, didn't arrive with a roar. It arrived with a misstep, a slip, a crack of bone, and then it stayed. 600,000 years ago, there was no first aid, no neat roll of bandages, no antiseptic cream in a tidy tube. A broken leg wasn't just pain, it was a sentence that might last the rest of your days. Infection wasn't a word yet, but it was a reality everyone knew. The smallest cut could turn sour, swelling, hot, and red, until fever burned through the body. A splinter could become an abscess, a toothache could turn into death. Imagine walking across uneven ground, carrying firewood, and your ankle twists. In modern times, You'd hobble to a clinic, get an X-ray, maybe a cast. In the Stone Age, you had nothing but the hope that the group would slow for you, that someone would share the burden of carrying food, that your body would knit itself back together without splintering further. Splints were improvised with sticks and bindings of hide or plant fiber, but whether they worked was a matter of luck and position. Some bones healed crooked, leaving permanent limps. Some never healed at all. And then there was infection. With no understanding of germs, people relied on observation. They noticed that wounds washed in running water sometimes fared better, that smoke or ash seemed to dry and protect injuries, that certain plants soothed when applied. But observation only went so far. A deep cut could become a death sentence, fever rising, delirium setting in, the body too weak to fight what it couldn't see. Death by infection was slow, agonizing, and common. The worst part wasn't just the pain. It was the loss of contribution. A hunter who couldn't hunt, a gatherer who couldn't walk far, a parent too weak to carry a child. These were burdens in a world that had no margin for error, yet early humans showed signs of care. Fossil evidence reveals skeletons with healed fractures, proof that others must have fed and protected the injured long enough for bones to mend. Compassion was not just kindness, it was strategy. A limping elder still carried knowledge, still told stories, still taught skills. A child with a crooked arm could still forage. The group survived better when it carried its wounded, and so it did. There was humor. Even in this grimness, someone who fell might laugh weakly, blaming the rock for attacking. Someone with a limp might call themselves faster than anyone, as long as everyone else agreed to hop. These jokes didn't cure wounds, but they cured despair, and despair was often more dangerous than the cut itself. Injury taught humans about fragility. It taught them that survival wasn't only about strength, but about cooperation. It taught them to slow when someone stumbled, to adapt when someone faltered, to plan for a future that included imperfection. And it taught resilience, the quiet miracle of bodies that chose to heal, that chose to stitch bone and knit flesh, even without bandages or medicine. So when you roll over tonight, comfortable, uninjured, perhaps with the faint memory of a paper cut being the worst of your day, think of them. Think of the man with the crooked leg who still followed the band, the woman with the scarred hand who still gathered roots, the child who survived infection by the grace of firelight and care. They remind us that the human story has always been one of endurance, of limping forward together, and of finding reasons to laugh, even when nothing in the world seemed funny. Foraging 600,000 years ago was equal parts treasure hunt and Russian roulette. Imagine walking through the brush, stomach grumbling, eyes scanning for anything edible. A bush heavy with berries looks like salvation. Little jewels glistening in the sunday. You pluck one, roll it between your fingers, sniff it cautiously, and then pop it into your mouth. Sweet at first, a bit tart. And then, hours later, you're doubled over, clutching your stomach, cursing your curiosity. Accidental poisoning was the silent ambush of prehistoric life, and it struck with all the subtlety of a badly timed, practical joke. Our ancestors didn't have field guides, no neatly printed photos of edible versus deadly plants. They had trial, error, and the unlucky volunteers who happened to be hungriest that day. Some berries were nutritious, packed with sugars that fueled weary bodies. Others contained alkaloids and toxins designed by nature as a warning label, except the label was written in the language of stomach cramps, hallucinations, or even death. Mushrooms were the tricksters of the food world. Some nourished, others killed, and distinguishing between them was not always easy. A cap with a little white dot might mean dinner, or it might mean that the entire group would be burying someone by sunset. It's not hard to imagine a moment by the fire, someone groaning after sampling a handful of shiny red berries, and the others shaking their heads. Well, we're crossing that one off the menu. A grim way of learning, but effective. Over generations, knowledge accumulated, passed down in whispers and warnings. Don't eat the bitter ones. Avoid the ones that stain your fingers. Test small quantities first. This folklore wasn't written, but it lived in memory and habit. The cost of forgetting was too high. Some poisons worked slowly, weakening rather than killing outright. Imagine days of dizziness, of blurred vision, of stumbling, as if the world had tilted on its side. That sort of suffering wasn't just individual, it endangered the whole group, slowing movement, draining resources. Sometimes hallucinations were involved. Visions that must have felt like messages from the spirit world, but were really just the nervous system being tricked by toxins. It's possible that early human spirituality was nudged into being by someone accidentally chewing on the wrong mushroom, and then insisting they'd just spoken to a glowing elk. Humor, dark as always, surely came into play. Someone might have groaned, "At least if I die, I'll taste better from all these berries." Someone else might have teased the mushroom sampler for volunteering as a prophet. These jokes didn't erase the danger, but they gave shape to the fear. And fear, with laughter, was easier to live with than fear alone. Accidental poisoning shaped our species in subtle ways. It encouraged caution, sharpened memory, and fostered communication. If you discovered that a certain leaf made you sick, it wasn't enough to know it yourself. You had to tell everyone else, teach the children, remind them during foraging. This was survival through shared knowledge, through the collective brain of the group. And slowly, very slowly, humans built a mental library of what was safe, what was deadly, and what was sometimes one or the other, depending on the season. So tonight, as you think of pantries full of safe, labeled foods, consider the miracle of not having to play that game every day. Our ancestors did, and many lost. But enough remembered, enough laughed. In spite of stomach cramps, enough carried the knowledge forward. That's why you don't have to guess whether your snack is food or poison. You already know, because someone 600,000 years ago made the mistake for you. If poison was the trickster outside the body, disease and parasites were the villains who set up camp inside it. Prehistoric life wasn't just about avoiding predators or accidents. It was about dealing with invaders that came in microscopic form, enemies you couldn't see, but that could knock you down faster than any lion. The human body was both fortress and buffet, and parasites considered it an all-you-can-eat invitation. Worms wriggled through guts, feasting on nutrients. Lice and fleas turned scalps and skin into restless landscapes of itching. Protozoa in water spread fevers that burned from the inside out. Imagine lying in a cave, sweating in the cold, shivering in the heat, your body confused by the infection raging inside. The group huddled around, unsure whether to wait it out, to move on without you, or to try some plant remedy gathered from the edges of memory. Some plants soothed, others did nothing. But knowledge wasn't yet clear. Disease was a roulette wheel that spun every time you drank from a stream, every time a cut festered, every time a mosquito landed. Parasites weren't just nuisances. They drained strength. Worms meant fewer calories absorbed, meaning the effort of a hunt might not be fully rewarded in energy. Lice and fleas spread bacteria, turning irritation into epidemic. Even tuberculosis and other long-term killers were likely whispering in human bones back then. Diseases that could simmer in a population for years. Illness was part of life, as constant as hunger or weather. Humor might have been the only weapon when no cure was available. Someone scratching furiously might earn a teasing nickname. Someone staggering with fever might insist they'd simply walked too far in their dreams. These jokes didn't heal. but they kept despair from becoming a second illness. And yet, disease shaped humanity profoundly. It pressed our immune systems into service, training them like relentless drill sergeants. It made survival a badge of resilience, passing strong defenses to children. It encouraged social behaviors, keeping fires, smoking to drive away insects, moving camps when sickness spread, learning which water sources were trustworthy. Even cooperation in care, feeding the sick, keeping them warm, was a survival strategy. Compassion wasn't just noble, it was practical. A sick person who recovered became living proof that care could tip the balance. The invisible villains never went away, of course. They followed us through centuries, through every migration and settlement. But what kept us alive was the same thing that still does: endurance, adaptation, and the stubborn will to laugh at discomfort, even when the joke is weak. So as you rest tonight, remember that your body is the descendant of countless survivors, immune systems forged in fire, humor honed in feverish nights, and persistence carried through generations. You are here because they endured their internal villains. And that is no small victory. Conflict among our prehistoric ancestors was rarely the neat, organized affair we imagine today when we picture armies and flags. 600,000 years ago, it was raw, intimate, and often born from desperation. Imagine two small bands of early humans, both thin from a lean season, stumbling into the same grove, heavy with figs. For weeks, they've been gnawing on roots and scraping marrow from brittle bones. And suddenly, here's abundance hanging in the sun like a miracle. At first, there might be tense glances, an unspoken agreement that maybe the bounty could be shared. But hunger has sharp edges, and patience dulls quickly when children's bellies are empty. A growl here, a shove there, and suddenly sticks meant for digging and stones meant for cracking nuts are in fists instead of hands. Violence didn't always wait for food shortages. Waterholes were another flashpoint. A clear spring was gold, but it could only quench so many mouths. If two groups arrived at once, the stairs across the water carried weight heavier than stones. Sometimes they postured, puffing up, hurling insults in whatever half language they had. Other times, the fight leapt forward, a chaos of pushing, biting, swinging, bodies colliding like storm waves. Weapons weren't forged steel, but the nearest heavy object, the sharpest flake of flint. The damage was still devastating. Skulls dug up from ancient sites bear the signatures of these encounters. Fractures that don't look like accidents. Bones healed, crooked after a fight. Sometimes even embedded stone tools. Archaeologists find evidence of wounds given and received. Silent proof that social conflict was already part of humanity's story. Violence was not constant. It was expensive. An injured man slowed the group. A dead woman meant fewer children. And every life was precious in a world already filled with predators and famine. But when the choice came down to them or us, blood was spilled, and survival was written in bruises and scars. Yet even in this darkness, humor must have crept in. Around the fire after a scuffle, someone might laugh that at least they'd gotten a free haircut when a stone shaved the side of their head. Someone else might brag, exaggeratedly, claiming they'd fought off 10 men, when in truth, they'd just been pushed into a bush. These stories softened fear, reshaped trauma into legend, and helped groups bond even after conflict. Because the truth was, no one wanted endless fighting. Cooperation was still the glue of survival. And conflict, though sometimes unavoidable, was never the whole story. What's striking is that violence didn't only tear groups apart, it forced them to think about how to live together. To avoid constant bloodshed, humans learned boundaries. They developed signals and rituals to show strength without escalation. They built habits of trade, of gift-giving, of exchanging marriage partners, of telling stories that emphasized shared ancestry. They created culture to soften the sharp edges of competition. The clash of cavemen, then, wasn't just about blows. It was about the birth of politics, of negotiation, of learning to argue without always swinging stones. And in that slow evolution of conflict and compromise, humanity discovered both its darkest and most resilient sides. Being a child 600,000 years ago was not the blissful, toy-filled experience we imagine today. Childhood, then, was peril, wrapped in small bones and wide eyes. Children were fragile in a world that demanded toughness. Their steps were clumsy on uneven ground, their voices too high-pitched to scare away predators, their bodies too small to withstand the chill of night or the grip of sickness. Every day was a test, and many did not pass it. Imagine a toddler near a fire, fascinated by the dance of flame. One stumble, one unguarded moment, and burns scarred, tiny hands. Imagine a child wandering too far from the group while chasing a butterfly, only to vanish into tall grass where a leopard had been waiting silently. Rivers, too, claimed the curious and the reckless. A child, leaning too far to see their reflection, might tumble in, swept away before anyone could react. Even food was risky. What looked like a sweet berry to an adult was a deadly temptation to a child who didn't yet know the rules of the landscape. The dangers weren't only external. Children's immune systems were still developing, and disease struck them first and hardest. Fever could carry a child away in days. Malnutrition left them weak, slow to grow, vulnerable to every parasite. And yet, despite all this, children survived often enough to keep humanity moving forward. They were carried, swaddled in furs, protected by circles of adults who watched over them with fierce devotion. Fossils show small footprints next to larger ones, the mark of hands held tight, of children guided carefully across treacherous ground. There must have been laughter too. Children were as funny then as they are now. Their mispronounced attempts at words, their clumsy tumbles, their fascination with bugs and rocks. These were sources of joy in lives, otherwise heavy with labor. A child's giggle in a cave was like sunshine trapped indoors, a reminder of why the adults fought so hard to keep them alive. Jokes probably bubbled up even after tragedy, dark humor as medicine. At least he outran the rabbit before tripping. Laughter softened grief, turned terror into something a group could bear together. The peril of children shaped humanity profoundly. It made adults cautious, made groups more cooperative, made everyone willing to share food or carry an extra burden if it meant one more child survived. Because children were the future. Literally, every small body represented generations yet to come. Their survival wasn't just personal, it was species survival. And so, even in a dangerous world, humanity built rituals of protection around its smallest members. They wrapped them, rocked them, taught them, held them close at night while predators prowled outside. As you drift into sleep, think of them. The children curled up by fires that smoked and flickered, their eyelids heavy after a day of danger and wonder. They were fragile, yes, but they were also resilient. Small sparks carried carefully across the darkness of prehistory. Without them, there would be no story, no us, no you lying warm in bed tonight. Every giggle that survived was a victory. Every child's breath, a quiet rebellion against a world that wanted to snuff them out. Humanity endured not just through strength, but through the fierce tenderness that protected its smallest and most vulnerable. The weather of 600,000 years ago was not the predictable, calendar-ready rhythm we enjoy today, with forecasts, radars, and apps that politely tell us to bring an umbrella. Back then, the sky had tantrums. Storms rolled in with no warning. Floods appeared like sudden enemies, and lightning bolts didn't just strike the ground, they struck terror. Imagine sitting near a fire one evening, belly full for once, telling stories in the half-light, and then hearing the low grumble of thunder on the horizon. At first, It was almost soothing, a deep drumbeat reminding everyone that the sky was alive. But that rumble grew teeth, became a roar, and then came the first strike, a flash so bright it lit every wrinkle in the landscape. The ground shook, the air smelled of ozone, and hair stood on end. It was no gentle bedtime rain, it was the heavens throwing a tantrum, and everyone below was caught in the middle. Floods were the trickiest of these tantrums. They came fast and without compromise. A dry gully that looked safe enough to cross in the afternoon could, by nightfall, become a raging torrent, carrying logs, stones, and unlucky animals along with it. For people traveling in small groups, floodwaters were deadly. They could sweep away firewood, food supplies, and even family members in an instant. Imagine trying to cross a river on foot and suddenly realizing the water wasn't just tugging at your legs, it was grabbing, pulling, eager to drag you under. And when one person slipped, others often risked themselves to save them, creating chains of desperation against a force that didn't care how strong your grip was. Storms turned nights into chaos. Wind ripped through camps, tearing apart shelters made of branches and hides. Rain pounded the earth until it became mud, sucking at ankles, swallowing fire. The fire, the sacred center of warmth and protection, was the storm's favorite victim. One good gust, one relentless downpour, and that precious flame was gone, leaving nothing but smoke and despair. And lightning, unpredictable and furious, could reduce a tree to splinters in a heartbeat. It didn't take imagination to believe the sky was angry, yet humor slipped in. Perhaps someone muttered that the storm was just the gods, washing their dishes too noisily. Maybe, after a close lightning strike, the group teased the man, whose hair was still standing, straight up. Dark humor was a survival mechanism, softening the raw terror of watching nature flex muscles far greater than your own. But storms were not only destructive, they also taught. They taught the value of higher ground, of building shelters away from riverbanks, of watching the sky for the subtle signs of change. They forced humans to think about storage, to keep food tucked away safely, to protect embers in containers of ash, so fire could be revived after rain. They forced adaptation, and in doing so, they gave us something unexpected: resilience. The tantrums of the weather, though terrifying, trained humanity to expect the unexpected. Every bolt of lightning, every thunderous downpour, every flash flood carved lessons into memory. Lessons that allowed the species to inch closer to mastery of the world. As you listen now, tucked warm in your bed, the sound of distant rain might lull you. For our ancestors, that same sound was a warning, a call to vigilance. They endured it, they learned from it, and they passed those lessons forward. Their survival is why you can relax tonight, knowing the tantrums outside won't sweep your bed away or silence your fire. They faced the wild moods of the sky and lived to tell their children stories about it, stories that eventually became ours. Separation from the group was perhaps the most haunting fate a prehistoric human could face. In a world where safety came in numbers, to be alone was to be exposed. Imagine waking in the early dawn, the fire, nothing but ash, and realizing that the soft murmur of voices and the shuffle of feet is gone. The group has moved, perhaps not far, but far enough that you can't hear them. Panic doesn't arrive all at once, it creeps in. First, you tell yourself they're nearby. Then you shout, expecting an answer. Silence answers back, and suddenly the trees feel taller, the shadows darker, the air colder. Being alone stripped away layers of protection. Predators that might hesitate before approaching a group had no reason to pause at the sight of a solitary figure. A single human was not a hunter, not a rival, but prey. Every rustle in the brush became a threat, every bird call a signal of movement. Nights were worse. Without the comfort of shared firelight and watchful eyes, darkness pressed in like a suffocating weight. Fear wasn't abstract. It was the knowledge that no one would hear if you screamed. Food gathering, too, became harder. A group could spread out, search wide areas, and share what they found. Alone, your chances dwindled. Miss one route, scare off one animal, and hunger grew. Injuries became catastrophic. A twisted ankle, a cut, anything that slowed you was magnified by the absence of helping hands. And illness, it could silence you in the forest without anyone even knowing. But perhaps the deepest wound was loneliness itself. Humans are wired for connection, and even then, laughter and chatter around a fire were as vital as food. Alone, silence became unbearable, pressing in until the mind filled it with voices that weren't there. Some might have sung to themselves, others whispered to imagined companions, trying to hold on to sanity against the heavy silence. And yet, humor might have flickered here, too. A lonely wanderer might mutter, "At least I don't have to share my berries now." Or, finally, "No one to snore beside me." But jokes can't build shelters, can't keep fires lit, can't replace the steady rhythm of footsteps beside your own. Most who were separated either found their way back or didn't survive long enough to matter in the story. Those who did return carried tales of fear, reminders that to stay with the group was not just comfort, but life itself. The lonely ones taught humanity the value of community. They became the cautionary tales that children heard by the fire. Don't wander too far. Don't chase butterflies beyond sight. Don't linger when the group moves. Their fear became instruction, their survival or their absence, a constant reminder that humans were not built to endure alone. Together, they could challenge the world. Alone, they were a whisper against the storm. So tonight, as you lie safe, maybe even enjoying solitude, remember that your ancestors did not have that luxury. Their loneliness was dangerous, their silence heavy, their isolation a peril rather than a choice. You carry their memory when you seek out company, when you laugh in groups, when you feel relief at another's presence. And because of them, you're never truly alone. Their footsteps, their voices, their fears still echo in you, guiding you, reminding you that survival has always been a shared endeavor. Life, 600,000 years ago, was already dangerous enough without accidents. But our ancestors were humans through and through, capable of moments that were as clumsy as they were tragic. If nature's predators and storms were relentless, human error was equally creative. Picture a man striding confidently across a rocky slope with an armful of firewood, his group watching admiringly at his strength. Then, one pebble rolls underfoot, balance tilts, and suddenly, he's tumbling end over end like a rag doll, the carefully gathered logs scattering across the hillside. It might have looked absurd at first, arms flailing, body bouncing. But the laughter, if there was any, quickly soured when the body didn't get up. What we'd call slapstick today could become a deadly spectacle then, and life rarely distinguished between the ridiculous and the catastrophic. Falls were common villains in this prehistoric comedy of errors. Cliffs and ridges promised vantage points for spotting prey, but they also promised long drops. A curious child or a distracted adult could misjudge a step, and in an instant, the adventure turned into silence at the canyon's bottom. Water, too, had its pratfalls. Slipping on slick rocks while fishing or collecting water often sent people sprawling into rapids or shallow pools, where skulls cracked against stone. Imagine someone returning to camp soaked, hair plastered against their head, while their companions chuckled nervously, half in relief and half in the knowledge that next time the fall might not end with laughter. Fire created its own accidents. Sparks leapt when no one expected them, setting hides or hair aflame. An enthusiastic attempt to add fuel could result in singed eyebrows, a scene that may have drawn nervous laughter, at least until the flames spread to the shelter itself. Suddenly, a joke about someone's smoking hair turned into a frantic scramble to save food stores before they burned. The thin line between comedy and disaster was never clearer than when fire misbehaved. Even tools had their hazards. A sharp flint flake was a miracle of design, but it was also an eager participant in accidents. A slip while cutting meat could leave a deep gash. Two people napping stones too close together might send shards flying into each other's eyes, and while one might laugh awkwardly through the sting, infection often followed, and humor had to surrender to the slow spread of fever. Still, people joked. They had to. Maybe they teased the man who fell into the river, calling him part fish. Maybe they laughed at the woman who burned her hair, saying she was trying to invent new hairstyles. Humor softened the fear that hovered over every misstep. It turned accidents into stories, stories into lessons. By laughing at what could kill them, they made it less terrifying, at least for a moment. But the lesson lingered. The man who fell off a ledge became the cautionary tale. The burned shelter was remembered when future fires were built farther from the walls. Accidents were teachers, though harsh and unrelenting. Every slapstick stumble that ended badly was folded into human memory, a silent rule written into the unspoken laws of survival. Don't run near cliffs. Don't lean too close to fire. Don't carry too much when the ground is slick. The Comedy of Errors was humanity's first instruction manual, written in bruises and scars, and while it might have seemed funny in flashes, the laughter always carried an edge of fear. Death was not just an event for early humans. It was a presence, a teacher, and eventually a culture. 600,000 years ago, loss was frequent and brutal. Illness, predators, accidents, starvation, each claimed lives regularly. But humans are not creatures who merely endure. We react, we adapt, we find meaning, even in what seems meaningless. When someone died, it was not simply the disappearance of a body. It was a tear in the fabric of the group, and how that tear was handled shaped the beginnings of human culture. At first, death may have been greeted with silence, confusion, perhaps fear. A body doesn't rise again, doesn't breathe, doesn't laugh at jokes. For a group deeply tied to every member's survival, this absence was felt immediately. Who would carry food? Who would watch at night? Who would share stories? But over time, death also became a moment to reflect, to ritualize. Archaeological evidence suggests that even before language was sophisticated, humans treated their dead with care. Some were buried with tools, with stones carefully arranged, with signs that death was not the end of identity, but a transition into something the living still acknowledged. Imagine a small group gathered in a cave, firelight flickering against walls, as they placed a fallen companion in the earth. Maybe someone whispered words they barely understood themselves. Sounds meant to comfort, meant to mark the moment as sacred. Maybe flowers or herbs were laid down, not for beauty alone, but for scent, to soften the harsh reality of decay. These were the first rituals, the earliest attempts to make sense of loss. By honoring the dead, humans were also protecting the living from despair. Children asked questions, no doubt, tugging at elders' hands, wanting to know why someone no longer moved. Answers weren't scientific, but they were stories, explanations woven from imagination and necessity. Maybe the dead became stars in the sky, glowing softly to remind the living they were not entirely gone. Maybe they became animals, watching over the group. Maybe their spirits lingered in the fire's smoke. These ideas shaped culture, turned raw grief into traditions, and laid the foundations for religion and myth. Humor found its way here, too, in gentle, bittersweet ways. Perhaps someone joked softly that the dead man was lucky he didn't have to endure another lean winter. Maybe laughter erupted when memories of clumsy moments were retold, reminding everyone that even the deceased had lived fully, awkwardly, humanly. Laughter at funerals is not new. It is one of the oldest medicines, a way to stitch grief with threads of joy. Death, handled communally, reinforced bonds. People sat closer, shared food more carefully, watched children more closely. They remembered the fallen not just as cautionary tales, but as part of their identity. To speak of someone after they were gone was to keep them alive in story. And those stories built culture. They carried lessons, humor, warnings, love. They turned the dead into ancestors, into something greater than memory alone. So, death was never only death. It was the spark of culture, the first rituals, the first philosophies. It forced humans to ask questions, to invent answers, to imagine a world beyond the visible. It gave rise to reverence, to art, to community that endured beyond the life of any single member. And that reverence, in turn, shaped us. We became not just survivors of loss, but meaning makers, capable of transforming even the harshest reality into stories that soothed. As you rest tonight, think of them not as nameless bones buried in distant soil, but as the originators of something we still practice. Every funeral, every story told in remembrance, every laugh through tears is an echo of those early moments by the fire when humans first realized that death could be cultural. And because of them, we don't face loss as silence alone, but as song, ritual, and memory. They turned death into something bearable, something deeply human. Survival in the Stone Age wasn't a straight line. It wasn't guaranteed to the strongest or the fastest or even the cleverest. It was a grim lottery, a game of chance with stakes higher than any modern gamble. Imagine two hunters leaving camp on the same morning. One trips on a root, twists his ankle, and limps home, embarrassed but alive. The other walks the same path an hour later, doesn't trip, but meets a lion in the tall grass and never returns. The ankle injury, which seemed like bad luck, saved one life. The unbroken stride, which seemed like good fortune, cost the other his. This randomness defined existence. A sudden storm could strike just one valley, drowning those unlucky enough to live there. A predator could single out one straggler in a group and ignore the rest. A child might reach for berries and pluck the safe ones, while another child, standing a few feet away, picked the poisonous ones. There was no grand justice system deciding outcomes. Life and death were often separated by the width of a footprint, yet patterns did emerge. Stronger bodies, sharper minds, quicker reactions, these tipped the odds in a person's favor, though never completely. Social ties mattered even more. Those with caring groups around them survived broken bones and illnesses, while loners vanished without trace. Cooperation was the hidden ticket in the lottery. A person who shared food might one day find others sharing with them when their own luck failed. A woman who tended to a feverish child might be repaid years later, when that grown child brought down a deer that fed the group. But always, luck hovered over it all. Some were in the wrong place when rocks fell, or rivers swelled, or diseases spread. Others were simply elsewhere, spared by nothing more than geography. Fossil evidence shows families wiped out, while others thrived nearby. There is no fairness in this, no comfort, except the knowledge that survival was not only about merit, but also about chance. And yet, this very randomness shaped us. It taught humility. It taught the importance of groups, because chance is easier to survive when you're not facing it alone. Humor must have been one way to cope with this unfairness. After all, when someone survived a close call, a boulder crashing down just behind them, a predator choosing someone else, the laughter was nervous but real. "See, I told you the spirits like me more." "No," someone else replied. "They're just saving you for later." Such jokes acknowledged the grim lottery while softening its cruelty. The reality was harsh. Not everyone lived, and no one could predict who would. But that uncertainty pushed humans to prepare, to cooperate, to pay attention. The lottery was grim, yes, but it also forced resilience. Each survival wasn't just luck. It was a small victory that carried lessons forward. Every scar, every story, every whispered warning, became another way to tip the odds, however slightly, in favor of life. And in that uneven, unfair game, humanity kept pulling winning tickets just often enough to carry the story forward to us. And here we are, proof that enough tickets in that grim lottery came up winners. It's astonishing, really, that we're still here at all. Think of it. Small groups huddled against the cold, stalked by predators, plagued by sickness, struck by storms, and yet somehow, against all odds, their line continues in you. The strange miracle of human persistence is not that individuals survived. Most didn't, but that enough of them did, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years, until survival became history, and history became memory. What made this possible wasn't just luck, though luck was always there. It was adaptability, the quiet genius of bending instead of breaking. Fire was coaxed from sparks, shelters were built from branches and stone, roots were dug when hunts failed, stories were told, so lessons weren't lost. Humans didn't have claws or fangs or speed, but they had something subtler, the ability to imagine a tomorrow and to prepare for it, even when today was brutal. Cooperation was the other miracle. No one truly survived alone, though some tried. The groups that cared for their wounded, that shared food, that protected children, endured longer than those that didn't. Compassion became strategy, and strategy became tradition. Even grief became fuel. The death of one person taught the living how to avoid the same fate. Loss was woven into survival, and through it, resilience grew. And of course, there was humor. Imagine the long nights, storms battering outside, predators growling in the dark. Laughter rose anyway. Someone teased about singed hair. Someone mimicked the clumsy fall of a friend. It wasn't frivolous, it was necessary. Humor kept despair from sinking too deeply into the group. It reminded them that even in darkness, there was light to be found in each other. That strange, stubborn joy was part of the persistence too. Now, lying in your bed, you are the living evidence of that persistence. Every breath you take is the end of a chain of millions who breathed before you, some shivering in caves, some limping through forests, some laughing around smoky fires. You carry their resilience, their adaptability, their humor, their will to keep moving forward. Against hunger, against predators, against storms and poisons and diseases, humanity persisted. That is why you are here, in comfort, listening, warm, and safe. So let this soothe you. The world may still hold challenges, but compared to theirs, your survival is already a miracle. Close your eyes and rest in that knowledge. You are the child of persistence, the heir of luck, the proof that humanity has always found a way. And as the night deepens, remember, the story didn't end in the Stone Age. It continues now, in you, and in the quiet rhythm of your breathing as you drift into sleep. And that's where we'll leave our journey tonight. The storms, the laughter, the dangers, and the persistence of our ancestors all carried forward into you. Now, it's your turn to rest. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep take over. If you're still awake and want more, there are 2 more stories waiting for you on the screen. Just tap one and drift even deeper. And if you haven't yet, remember to subscribe so you never miss the next night's tale. Sleep well, dream softly, and I'll see you in the next story.